The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, on the first episode of On Poly for 2025, John Michael McGrath and yours truly discuss Justin Trudeau's departure and some guy in Florida who keeps threatening to annex us. Plus, how a former Scarborough MPP found himself living in a homeless shelter. Then, uncanceling Sir John A. Macdonald. That's all ahead on the agenda. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, Justin Trudeau has resigned, Parliament has been suspended, and a leadership race is coming.
We look at the story of a former Scarborough MPP who found himself homeless, yet also discovered he has lots of friends.
Ontario was supposed to be fully accessible right now. Spoiler alert, it isn't. So now what?
And your column, my column, focuses on what the months ahead could bring for Ontario voters.
And I'll focus on Doug Ford's number one decision in 2025.
It's Friday, January 10th, 2025, our first episode of the new year, so let's get to it.
Hey, partner.
Oh, sir.
Our first sugar of the year.
Yes, indeed.
There
Happy
we go.
New Year.
Happy New Year. You got Godzilla on today.
Yeah, this was a Christmas present from my wife, and haven't done a nerdy t-shirt in a while, so I thought I would bring Godzilla to the stage.
Now, we did not plan this, but I am also wearing a Christmas present.
Okay.
This is from my brother-in-law and sister-in-law who live in Sudbury, Scott and Sylvia Rennie. And they call this a Sudbury tuxedo.
Okay.
That's what they called it. So I thought, this is a good time of year to bring it out. Why not?
You're always bringing the Canadian culture here.
There we go. I like to do that. Well, we got a full boat today, so shall we get to it?
Let's do it.
Off to issue one. This has been one of the most extraordinary weeks in Canadian and Ontario political history. First, the Prime Minister's resignation. Second, some guy in Florida says he wants to annex Canada to become the 51st state. Third, Ontario's Premier says, forget that, how about we take Alaska and Minnesota? JMM, to say the least, a bit of a different time this week.
Yeah, I mean, on the 51st state stuff, all I'm going to say is that the president-elect hasn't even been inaugurated yet, and I feel like I'm going to spend the next 4 years like therapy screaming into a pillow.
I may join you. Just let me know.
Yeah. Familiar feelings from 2016 to 2020, right? On the resignation of Justin Trudeau, this is one of these things that I think we all suspect was inevitable. It was still less than a month ago, if you can believe, that Chrystia Freeland resigned as finance minister and deputy prime minister. I think it's fair to say that on the way out the door, she absolutely torched the PM's ability to stick around until a fall election later this year. Freeland also instantly reactivated and re-energized Trudeau's critics within his own party and made it impossible for him to hold on.
It was an interesting moment because for all the people who said, she may be good at the issues, but she's really not a great performer and she's not a great politician, that was a very skillful political move.
It was an absolute dagger,
yeah.
Right? It was a perfectly, I mean, even just the writing of the statement itself, I appreciate it as a writer, like words were really well crafted in that statement to do maximum damage.
Now, do you mind if I get a little nerdy on you here?
Please.
That's
what
our
else
brand.
are we here for?
Exactly. One of the things that caught my attention this week was the complete absence of what I might call old-time civility. And by that I mean, I have seen in the past that when a first minister steps down, things are different. Trudeau made his announcement. Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, was immediately out there with a video saying, good riddance, you can't trust the Liberals to do anything right. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, was immediately out there, pivoting from blasting Trudeau to blasting everybody else who sat at the cabinet table or in the caucus room. Now, I will confess I'm a bit of a fuddy-duddy when it comes to civility in politics. I kind of like it. Back in the day, when a first minister stepped down, even if they were, I'll just say this, as unloved as the current prime minister apparently is, there was an obligation by all players to at least pause for 1 second to say, thank you for your service to Canada. We didn't agree on everything that you wanted to do. You did your best. None of that happens anymore. They use this line, we thank your family for loaning you to us as you did your best for the country. I don't know, maybe I'm too old-fashioned about this, but I have seen this work in other circumstances. I think back to 2002, when Mike Harris was stepping down as Premier of Ontario and Dalton McGuinty was the then opposition leader. And they got up in the legislature and people gave speeches to say goodbye to Mike Harris. And Dalton McGuinty, who you have to know, he and Mike Harris just at a personal level, right, did not like each other, and they ran really brutal, tough campaigns against each other. But there they were, rising to the occasion on the day, before getting to all the other stuff, saying, you know, thank you for your contribution to the province of Ontario. I would like to have seen a little more class at the federal level, but we didn't see it.
No, and, you know, to stick with federal examples, right? I mean, when Brian Mulroney left, he was not widely beloved. His reputation improved with time, but, you know, we can certainly remember that he was not loved as a politician, and yet, you know, people said nice things about him when he announced his retirement. Even the current Prime Minister's father, Pierre Trudeau, when he announced his retirement the second time. Brian Mulroney, actually, I mean, somebody posted the Hansard transcript to Twitter this week, just as an example of like such a contrast, right? That Brian Mulroney, who, you know, was setting out to defeat the Trudeau Liberals as you know, as much as he could, still was able to say respectful, nice things about the then Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, even before he was Prime Minister, he's been in public life for 17 years, you know, first elected as
John Michael, he's actually been in public life for 53 years.
Well, yes.
He's been a public figure since the second he was born.
Yes, and you know, a resident of the Prime Minister's residence for a long time. Yeah. You know, Bonnie Crombie has substantial disagreements with Justin Trudeau, despite the fact that they are of the same, you know, party brand. You know, Crombie says she will not bring in a carbon tax. I think we all basically understand that Trudeau has depressed Liberal support in public opinion polling. You know, she might be happy to see the last of him, frankly, but she was still able to offer a respectful statement. Marit Stiles, different party, was still able to issue a statement saying, you know, thanking the Prime Minister for public service. So it is nice when people rise to the occasion.
Yeah, we understand that people don't love the current Prime Minister, and he overstayed his welcome, and, you know, that story has been well told.
Yes.
But, you know, for 5 minutes on the day he steps down, I agree with you. People could rise to the occasion. Now, the Prime Minister not only announced his intention to resign, but he also, as you know, prorogued Parliament, essentially bringing the business of Parliament to a timeout, to a standstill, I guess, for a couple of months. That means something very important to a select group of members of Parliament. Because Parliament was prorogued, they will not have served adequate time to be eligible for a Member of Parliament's pension. They had to make it to February, and obviously, of course, now they will not make it to February, so that may be another reason why MPs may not love what the PM just did, for what it's worth.
Meanwhile, Premier Doug Ford reacted to the announcement earlier this week. Let's take a look at what he said.
As long as he's Prime Minister, his main focus is not on the Liberal Party, is not on anything else. It should be the next 14 days making sure that we avoid these tariffs.
It's hard to think of two more different politicians than Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau, you know, different parties, different levels of government. They look pretty different. Their philosophies about how involved government should be in your life are pretty different. Yeah. They did cooperate pretty well on a couple of things. You know, the electric vehicles issue, multi-billions of dollars worth of cooperation and subsidies that both their levels of government have contributed to that file. I think they worked pretty well together during the COVID days as well. Public transit, the province has managed to convince the federal government to pony up multiple billions of dollars for that. So, yeah, they're very different guys, but they did manage to find the sweet spot on occasion and work well together. However, now with Parliament prorogued, what exactly can and cannot happen as we all start to think about what our response to the Trump tariff threats ought to be?
Well, so governments alone don't pass laws, right? Neither the federal parliament nor actually the Ontario legislature are sitting right now. Just before the holidays, the Ford majority at the legislature extended their winter break into March 3rd. It would have been back 2 weeks earlier otherwise. So nobody at the provincial or federal level can make any kind of legislative response to anything that happens south of the border. That said, despite the ambiguity currently in Ottawa. The Prime Minister is still the Prime Minister. His cabinet is still the cabinet. And there is a lot they can do short of passing new legislation. Basically, the powers of the Prime Minister are unchanged, right? So at the federal level, we know that they are discussing what kind of retaliatory tariffs the Canadian government might impose on American goods.
He's making a list and checking it twice.
Exactly.
If I can steal a line.
They one of the proposals, when governments write up these lists of the kinds of tariffs, right? They try to think of ways that will target politically sensitive constituencies in the United States, right? So Florida orange juice is one of those things that would target not just a Republican state, but a state the president is currently a resident of,
yes.
or president-elect, I should say. So that's the kind of thing that they are thinking about. And that is something that the Prime Minister and his cabinet can do without needing to recall MPs for any kind of vote. Doug Ford, of course, has also talked about responses that Ontario could muster. Before the break, we talked about things like the LCBO not buying as much American alcohol. And there's also been some discussion, I'm not even sure how this would work, but Ontario cutting off electricity supplies to the Midwestern states that we are connected to their power grids. But he's also trying to, give carrots and not just sticks, if I can put it that way. He has this week proposed, actually knitting our energy systems even more tightly together. Mm-hmm. Things, like Ontario building more and faster nuclear plants in order to help supply clean energy to the United States. So he is trying to both sweeten the deal with American politicians, as well as recognizing that if these tariffs come in, both Canadian and provincial governments are going to have to respond in ways to defend our own economic interests.
Much more to come on this one.
Absolutely.
And with that, we're off to issue 2. Over the holidays, the Toronto Star published a story about former Scarborough MPP Lorenzo Berardinetti, who found himself living in a homeless shelter. It was a sobering story about how fast life can change, and in particular, the precariousness of political life. Let's start with a little background here, shall we?
Yeah, this was actually something that came up first because of some filings that Berardinetti had to make after running in an election. When you run for an election, the City of Toronto audits your campaign spending after the fact, and Berardinetti had to basically write a letter saying, I cannot repay my campaign debts because I am currently without any resident or income. Berardinetti is a lawyer by trade. He was first elected to Toronto City Council in 1988, won his seat provincially in 2003 in Scarborough Southwest. He was a Liberal MPP for Dalton's first majority government and proceeded to hold that seat for 15 years for the entirety of the Liberal tenure at Queen's Park until the 2018 election, where Berardinetti, like a great many Liberal MPPs, lost their seats. That, of course, does not end the story. In 2022, Berardinetti had a massive seizure and actually he ended up in a coma for about a month. And he's now trying to rebuild his life by starting up a new law firm. He hopes to work with Legal Aid Ontario to help newcomers and refugees. But that medical incident seems to have been one of the things that really drained a lot of his savings and left him in his current financial state.
And he had a divorce in there as well, so his life really fell apart.
Yes.
Now, a couple of things here. First, the political world, I have to say, really responded well when the story in the Star was first published. There's a guy that many of us know named Justin Van Dett, who's kind of he's a political volunteer / backroom boy / fixer in East York, Ontario. And he looked at this situation and he said, I can't let this happen. And so he organized a GoFundMe page for Lorenzo, and people from all parties donated, for John Tory, Kathleen Wynne, across the political spectrum. The other point that needs to be made here is that, and this will come as news to many of you watching and listening right now, members of the Ontario legislature don't have a pension.
Yep.
They don't have MPP's pensions. They do federally, they don't provincially.
Yep.
Mike Harris, 30 years ago, got rid of MPP's pensions. This is always very funny because, I play hockey a couple of times a week, and when I talk to my hockey buddies, sometimes they will start railing about, politicians being
Gold-plated
overpaid.
pensions, yeah.
Gold-plated pensions and overpaid this and that. And I said, how much do you think the pension at Queen's Park is worth? And they'll go on to list some ridiculous figure. They probably all make 120 grand a year. I said, would it surprise you to know that the pension hasn't been around for 30 years? And they're all shocked. So in a strange way, Mike Harris got a real political bump 30 years ago by saying he was going to get rid of the pension. But then I think everybody's sort of forgotten that that's happened. And the reality is there are no pensions at Queen's Park anymore. When Kathleen Wynne was the premier, she, I think, along with the other party leaders, discovered that it was becoming increasingly difficult to get people to give up decently paying careers to run for provincial parliament if, we're saying to people, give up your best years of good earning potentially, and at the end of that, we're going to leave you unemployable and with no pension. So it's not all that appealing if you look at that. They thought they had a deal to make it happen, but what happened?
Well, the deal unfortunately fell apart. Kathleen Wynne became convinced, or her advisors convinced her, that this was going to be unpopular, and that even if it was a all-party agreement, she was going to be the one to wear the blame for it. The Liberals were, as any government is wont to do, they were trying to get reelected. They knew it was going to be a tough election, and this was one of those things they decided they were not going to pay the political price for.
So you've watched this for a while. What kind of impact do you think this has on dealings at Queen's Park, getting people to run, all of that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, we've talked before about, MPPs choosing not to run again because of the financial insecurity that the lack of a pension has, right? We've seen that cited just in this last legislature. I mean, Todd Smith has said that was one of the reasons that he decided to leave public office. It affects who runs and who does not, as you mentioned, right? I mean, it was not that long ago that, MPPs also didn't have salaries. I mean, before my lifetime, but there was this idea that we had to pay people more to professionalize politics because the only people who were running for elected office were basically people who could afford to take unpaid positions, basically. Being from we don't want a legislature that is just full of, frankly, rich people who can afford to take a few years off, right? Berard Netty talked about how his father worked in a lumber mill, right? It's a sign of mobility when the child of a guy in a lumber mill can rise to be an MPP. People really don't want to hire someone who lost their seat as well. There's a handful of exceptions to that, right? Some very prominent cabinet ministers can probably survive losing an election, but for the vast majority of MPPs, when they lose, that's a real hit to their future career. At the end of often years, in some cases decades of service, people end up without incomes, without a pension, and in the worst case scenario, in this case, they end up homeless, right?
I can imagine some people saying to themselves right now, come on, boys, do a little reality check here. There's lots of people hurting all over, and that is absolutely true.
Yes.
However, let's remember, Toronto City Councillors make a bigger salary than members of the Ontario Legislature. Yep. That is odd, if you ask me. Not only that, there have not been a salary increase at Queen's Park in 15 years.
Yep.
The salary's been frozen for a very long time. Yep. If you want good people to run for public office, at some point this issue has got to be dealt with. I understand it's box office poison when it comes to a government trying to push this through, but the reality is people won't stop being politicians at Queen's Park. They won't leave Queen's Park. We won't get the kind of dynamic turnover that maybe you want if people are hanging on because they've got no pension that will take care of their financial needs after they leave. So I think in many ways it's a bit of a mess.
Right. And, if you want quality people, you do have to pay them, right? And we know this in the public service, right? Whatever we can say about Phil Verster's legacy at Metrolinx, and many people have said many things, there was a reason why he was one of the most highly paid public servants in Ontario, because it's a big job, and because if you want to hire anybody to run that big a transit system, you're either going to pay Phil Versters or you're going to pay somebody who has his skill set, and those people do not come cheap.
That's the way it goes. And with that, we're off to issue 3. 20 years ago, the Ontario Legislature passed the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. It was, if you can imagine, a unanimous vote. The act was designed to develop, implement, and then enforce accessibility standards across the province. The deadline to make the province accessible just passed. It was January 1st this year. The deadline has passed, and here's your spoiler alert. Ontario is hardly what you would call barrier-free.
Yes. So according to groups such as the AODA Alliance, the province has fallen very, very short of the vision that the Act put forward. They put out a 10-point plan on how accessibility could still be improved in the province, from stiffer penalties to a residential housing accessibility standard. There have been some changes to the building code to make residential construction more accessible, but clearly not enough to satisfy the AODA Alliance or others. That said, a lot has changed since 2005. Again, spoiler alert, it's been 20 years. But, some of this stuff became very visible during the pandemic, right? COVID created huge accessibility issues for Ontarians. The plastic barriers between passengers and the bus driver that we see on the TTC, they are hard enough to talk through, but they can also pose obstacles for things like wheelchairs for people trying to board the bus, right? Enforcement of the new standards created by the province and by legislation has also been weak, according to the AODA Alliance. Without teeth, organizations just might lag on meeting their requirements because there is no one to penalize them for it. And here I will just, sticking with a bit of a transit theme here, the TTC here in Toronto, the transit operator, is bound by the AODA. It would take a lot of money to make all of the subway stations accessible. The TTC has been doing some work to add elevators to its subway stations, as for example, but many years ago they gave up even the pretense that they were going to meet the 2025 deadline. And when there's no penalty, like, why would you spend all the extra money?
Well, and frankly, I mean, we've had David Lepofsky, on the program many times, and he's probably the foremost disability rights advocate in Ontario history. Him or the former Lieutenant Governor David Onley, the two Davids, they've been pretty good on this issue. And, while Lepofsky obviously wants the government of Ontario to do all it can to move this issue forward, he also said, there's little things you can do too. Like if you're on a bus or on a streetcar, have either automated or have the driver announce what stops are coming up so that if you're visually impaired, you know where you are. And the TTC, normally does that, but for a while didn't do that. And Lepofsky had to complain again to get them to do that. So you don't need to necessarily do the multi-billion-dollar subway system redevelopment scheme. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit that could be done to make things better. But as you point out, and they talked about this for the 20 years when this bill was, after the bill was passed, if there are no penalties to not complying with the bill, why would anybody comply with it? So that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, we're off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular feature. We call it Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns that we wrote for our website, TVO.org, over the past week. What have you got up your sleeve for your first column of the year?
Well, spoiler alert, we both talked about election speculation.
I wonder why.
So I will try not to step all over your column, but let's just say there's a very real prospect of two elections in Ontario before Victoria Day. And I'm going to focus here on the federal election because I think the federal election is sort of necessarily going to be focused very heavily in Ontario, and not just because we are the largest province. Of course, in theory, there isn't supposed to be a federal election until the fall, but at this point, I don't think anybody expects the current federal government to survive a confidence vote if it even gets that far. So probably an election sometime in the spring. Based on the polls, the Liberals are going to be on the defensive basically everywhere. But the Conservatives already hold most of the seats west of Ontario. They'll probably do well in Atlantic Canada, but there's just not as many seats for grabs there. And Quebec, a big province, but also that's where the Bloc is leading. So that's going to put a ton of focus for seats here in Ontario, particularly Southern Ontario, and particularly the GTA. So if you are an Ontario voter, get prepared for a lot of attention. Your phone is going to be ringing. Your doorbell will also be ringing. And that's before we even get to the prospect of a provincial election, which leads me to ask, what did you write about this week,
Well,
Steve?
thank you. I'll just pick up that cue right there and say, yes, the number one toughest decision Doug Ford has to make this year, January 2025, is whether he wants to go early to the polls as so many of the hawks around him are urging, or whether he wants to adhere to the fixed election date law, which is to say the law says the election should be held in June of 2026, so a year and a half from now. Look, there's risks to going both ways. Here's essentially the arguments. The hawks are saying the opposition parties, Premier, are well behind you right now. They have evenly split the anti-Ford vote, so it's sort of a perfect storm for them in a bad way, a great opportunity for the Conservatives in a good way. The PCs are out fundraising their opponents. With Justin Trudeau's departure, there's a real vacuum of national leadership at the federal level right now, and the Premier is trying to fill it, and he's getting good plaudits actually for doing that. The last several first ministers who called early elections all won.
Yeah.
I know there is this thing that's saying, oh, don't call an early election, the public will punish you. Chrétien went early. John Horgan of British Columbia went early. Tim Houston in Nova Scotia went early. They all won re-election. Yeah. And in fact, Horgan went from minority to majority despite the early election. There's an RCMP investigation into the Greenbelt. Who knows when they're going to report back, but if you wait a year, it's possible the RCMP reports back.
Better to go earlier than later.
Well, that's another reason for it. And furthermore, if we're going to have a tariff war against Donald Trump, better it should be fought, the argument goes, by a premier who's just renewed his mandate and has got a 4-year shelf life underneath him, as opposed to somebody who's in the last year of his mandate. And, who knows, Donald Trump may see that as a sign of weakness and therefore want to exploit that even more. That's what the hawks are saying to the premier. The doves are saying, how's this going to look? You have a majority government. You have another year and a half to go in that majority government. When people ask you, what do you need an election for right now to spend $150 million to go a year and a half early, what's going to be the explanation? If Donald Trump is coming in on January 20th, which he is, do we really want to be focused on potentially a federal and provincial government at the same time? I mean, if our eye is supposed to be on the prize of tariffs, what's all that politicking going to do to that? The doves also say, you just never know. Doug Ford's plenty popular right now. But if you miscalculate and lose, you have cost yourself 14, 15, 16 years of being months, of being premier that you otherwise would have had. So, bottom line, there are risks to going early. There are risks to delaying until June of 2026. And it's one guy's decision. Yeah. It's all on his plate.
I have one thing to add to this, a little tidbit from my column that I think it will appeal to you. If we do in fact get 2 elections, and if the polls are roughly correct right now, and they might not be, but Doug Ford is leading pretty substantially in provincial polls, and Pierre Poilievre is leading very substantially in federal polls. If those are borne out, and we have 2 elections this year, we will see something that we have not seen in something like 60 years. 4 years of simultaneous majority Conservative governments at both Queen's Park and Parliament Hill. That has not been true since Diefenbaker was Prime Minister and Leslie Frost was Premier between 1958 and 1962.
That's a great little piece of trivia, and I think I can add one thing to that. In those years, Nathan Phillips was the Mayor of Toronto, Ontario's capital city, and he was a Tory. So you had Tories in power federally, provincially, and municipally. That's certainly the only time that's happened in my lifetime.
Yeah, so it would be not quite unprecedented, but a very rare thing. And what I say in the column is, elections are always important, but these ones will particularly bear paying attention to.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Campaigns matter, and there's a lot of balls juggling in the air right now, so we're going to cover it and just watch how it unfolds. All right, let us go to the mailbag. If you've got a burning question for us or an insightful comment, we always love hearing for you at onpolitics@tvo.org. And what have you got this week, JMM?
We have a question from listener Eli Zima Lust, I hope I'm pronounced that correctly, from Mississauga, who writes, "Hello, gentlemen. Big fan of the podcast as well as your individual works, too. I was recently looking at former federal election riding results, as one does, and came across a John Michael McGrath who ran in the 1996 Labrador by-election for the Reform Party.
Wow.
I thought I'd ask, does there happen to be any familiar relation with TVO's JMM? A highlight of my Friday evenings is listening to the pod. Keep up the great work. Thanks and best, Eli Zima Lust from Mississauga,
Were
Ontario."
you moonlighting as a Reform Party candidate on the Rock 30 years ago?
In 1996, I was 15 and thus ineligible to run for federal office, or provincial office, I should say. So no, I was not moonlighting moonlighting.
Do you know this guy?
No. I think I've come across this name before. I think somebody else has flagged it for me, but no, I never met this person. I did do some digging, though. So this John Michael McGrath was an economic development officer for the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, and assistant deputy minister of Northern Development for Newfoundland and Labrador. Because we're talking about Atlantic provinces, there's a possibility that he pronounced his surname McGrath and not McGrath.
Right.
So I want to flag that. In retirement, he volunteered at his local library at a housing complex and was the superintendent, SOUP, at a seniors lunch program, making both homemade bread and soup. He passed away in 2013 at the age of 77, a very interesting life, and we will put a link in the show notes in case you would like to learn more about him.
I mean, what are the odds, man? There's lots of John McGraths in this world.
Yes.
But John Michael McGrath, both of whom love politics in Canada?
Yeah, no, it's a pretty narrow slice of people. As I say, I think somebody had flagged this for me years ago on Twitter, like, oh, hey, have you seen this? And yeah, what can I say? We are Legion. We are everywhere.
Here's you want to talk another piece of ridiculous trivia here?
Sure.
I used to host a show here called Studio 2.
Yes.
My first co-host was Mary Hines, whom many people know from Tapestry on CBC Radio. There was a Mary Hines who ran for the NDP in several elections. So just as there was a Mary Hines who worked at TVO and ran for office, so apparently is there a John Michael McGrath who worked at TVO and ran for office. And it's 4 different people, lest anybody get confused.
All right. Again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show, you can always email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this January 10th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.
10 years ago this week, more than 400 history fans, including Ontario's Lieutenant Governor, the Premier, and a former Prime Minister, all gathered at the Royal York Hotel to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of Canada's first Prime Minister. That event could not be held today, at least certainly not without significant protests or maybe even vandalism. In the intervening years, Sir John A. Macdonald has been cancelled. Statues taken down, his name removed from schools, even taken off the $10 bill. Who would dare to push back against that overwhelming narrative? This guy, Patrice Dutil, is a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University, and he has a new book out. It's called Sir John A. Macdonald and the Apocalyptic Year 1885. And that brings him to our studio tonight. Good to see you again, Patrice.
Thank you, Steve.
Given everything I have just said, aren't you asking for a lot of trouble by trying to write a book about Sir John A. right now?
I hope not. I think it's important. 10 years after that great event, I was there. I was very happy to be there. It's time to start looking at the record, move away from this new reputation that's been given to Sir John A. Macdonald, and actually start looking at the record. So this was part of the work that I was doing, and I started looking into the Macdonald record a little bit more closely, and I found a lot of new information that I think should help restore the reputation of our first Prime Minister.
Let us do that then. We're going to look at, you say 1885 was the hardest of all of Macdonald's years in public life, and he had a lot of them.
Yes.
Why was 1885 so tough?
There's a running cascade of crisis after crisis. We know, of course, the second insurrection in the North, the first insurrection in the Northwest, but the second led by Louis Riel in 1885. People will remember that. That's something that's covered in school. But there's a whole bunch of other things. There's a confrontation with the new incoming government of Grover Cleveland in the United States. There's a debate with the British. There's all sorts of stories happening month after month after month through 1885, and that really makes it, I think, a compelling story.
How much of Macdonald's agenda in 1885 is protecting this, remember at the time, not even 20-year-old country from being absorbed into the United States?
Boy, things do change, don't they?
Or not.
Or not. It is a running concern throughout the year. There is a real concern in Macdonald's mind that if Canada shows weakness, there will be a renewed temptation in the United States to occupy a territory in the Northwest that is barely occupied. Maybe we've got 30,000 people. It's a wide open territory for an American army. There's a concern that Canada will appear weak if it doesn't manage its affairs with Great Britain. There's a concern about smallpox. We have an epidemic in 1885. There's all sorts of things. It really is about maintaining the sovereignty of Canada.
You said something a minute ago I should have followed up on, and I'm going to do that now, because you say, oh yeah, people know Louis Riel, they learn about him in school. I don't want to make an assumption that everybody knows who Louis Riel was and the significance he played in our history. So let's go there for a minute or two here. Who was Louis Riel?
Louis Riel is about 40 years old at that point. He's the leader of the Métis people, the French-speaking Métis people. He led an insurrection in 1870. He was a young man, 24 years old, barely 24 years old, 25. He, after that, is removed from Manitoba. He winds up in Quebec for a little while in what we used to call an insane asylum in those days. He then moves to the United States, becomes an American citizen, becomes a rancher, a school teacher, gets married, and in 1884 is brought back to the Northwest by a few leaders in the Métis community to try to sort out the position regarding the government of Canada. The Métis people are not happy. I should say some of the Métis people are not happy, and they want to renegotiate with Canada. They bring in Louis Riel because they thought that he would be the right kind of agent to talk to John A. Macdonald, which is a categorical mistake.
Well, some of Macdonald's advisors said, we should pay this guy to get lost because he was such a thorn in his side. And let's bring this up, Sheldon, if you would. I'm at the bottom of page 1 here. This is Sir John A. Macdonald responding to his advisors. He said, how would it look to be obliged to confess we could not govern the country and were obliged to bribe a man to go away? This would never do. He has a right to remain in Canada, and if he conspires, we must punish him. That's all. Given that he ended up at war with Riel, eventually putting him to death, maybe he should have tried to bribe him in the beginning?
Well, that's a really an interesting way to debate it. He could have. Again, he has the honor of the crown. He can't. Maybe he should have. Maybe he should have. As a counter history, maybe that would have saved him a lot of problems. But I don't think Macdonald took that kind of offer seriously. I don't think he knew Riel was driven by a certain mission, and it would have been pointless to give him money. And he was found guilty, Steve, by a court. Found guilty by a jury. So it wasn't Macdonald's decision to declare him guilty.
Right. There has been a great debate since then, though, about whether he was a crazed madman or an underappreciated father of Confederation. Where do you come down?
Louis Riel insisted that he was not crazy. Macdonald came to the conclusion that he was not insane. He commissioned a small group of 3 again, we didn't have psychiatrists in those days, but 3 people who were familiar with criminal mentalities, and they came to the conclusion that he was not crazy, that he was not insane, and so I mean that debate was put aside. However, the jury did think that he was not mentally stable and did recommend clemency, but that was not to unfold. The punishment for treason, high treason, which was what the claim against Riel was death.
Patrice, one of the reasons that people want to see statues of Sir John A. taken down are because of some of the things he said back in the day. Yeah. And here's one thing, and you quote it in your book. Yeah. Here's Sir John A. saying, the executions, after Riel was killed, the executions ought to convince the red man that the white man governs. Now, you'd agree that's a pretty racist thing to say that doesn't hold up too well.
Very much.
So what do we do about that?
You compare it with everything else that Sir John A. Macdonald said in his life about the red man, about the Indigenous people that he considered to be cornerstones of Canadian civilizations, people that he knew, people that he respected, people that in 1885 he insists should be given the right to vote. That's the real Macdonald. That kind of quotation, I cite it because it was witnessed. Is important, but he had other meanings in mind, I suspect, at that time. But he was driving the point that the government of Canada is the sovereign power in this country. It's not anybody else. And that, I think, was what he meant by that, beyond the obvious racist connotations of what he said. But I say put it in the context, in 1885, of the respect he demonstrated to the indigenous people in this country.
1885 is also a year when the buffalo are disappearing from the West, and it's a whole way of life that therefore is affected. The indigenous people were barely hanging on because of the loss of the buffalo. I want to know, in Ottawa, what were people urging Macdonald to do to respond to that?
Well, the buffalo starts disappearing in the 1870s. So by 1885, I mean, that's gone. When Macdonald returns to power in 1878, there are two ways of doing things. He could have simply left things as they were. The Liberal government under Alexander Mackenzie basically did that. They provided some support. Macdonald comes in and establishes a number of programs to help the indigenous people in the prairies. It's important that it's the prairies. It's not everybody in Canada that's suffering famine. It's in the prairies. Macdonald multiplies programs to help them. Now, yeah, the Liberals on the opposition are not particularly happy about this. The reality is that Macdonald is always running a deficit. He's spending more money than he has, and the Liberal opposition is hammering him for spending too much money. And so at one point he says, we're practically starving these people. What more do you want? He was responding to the Liberals. And sometimes it's been misinterpreted as saying that we're literally, forcing them to die of famine. That wasn't his intent. The people in Canada had racist views towards Indigenous people. We have to recognize that. That's what makes Macdonald, to my mind, stand out, that he was remarkably progressive in light of the general attitudes in the country at the time.
Okay, let me follow up on that. Where was he on the issue of whether or not Indigenous people at the time ought to be allowed to live their way of life or be assimilated into the broader country?
I think that Macdonald had two views on this. First of all, they should be left alone. But they should be encouraged to join the mainstream. He was assimilationist in that regard. Like everybody else in this country, they really considered that the old hunting-gathering method that had allowed the indigenous people in the prairies to survive was over. You had to learn how to farm. You had to learn how to use mechanics. It is very much part of the 1885 experience. That's why I emphasize so much the technological developments that are happening in that one particular year. He wants them to survive. He wants them to modernize. And if that means letting go of some of the old ways, so it is. They need to survive. They need to adapt. They need to join the mainstream. That's why he wants them to vote.
How would you compare Macdonald's treatment of Indigenous people in Canada compared to how successive American presidents dealt with the same issue in the United States?
There's absolutely no comparison. Let's not forget that Indigenous people in the United States are finding refuge in Canada because there's no food in the United States. There's no rations in the United States. There's no support in the United States. The Indigenous people in the United States are being eradicated. They come to Canada because under John A. Macdonald, there's protection and there's food. That's not a small thing. And it has to be remembered.
I'm going to bring up another quote from your book. Again, you're a pro-Macdonald guy, but you're not sugarcoating the record here. Yeah. Here we go, Sheldon. Quote board number 2. This is Sir John A. "We cannot change the barbarian, the savage, into a civilized man." British spelling of the word civilized there, incidentally. Now, you do tell us that you don't think Macdonald was a racist in the sense of he believed in the supremacy of the white race and everybody else was inferior. But by the standards of the time, how would you describe his attitude to other races?
The word civilized is capital here. What did John A. Macdonald mean by civilized? He meant basically people like him and the people that he hung around with, people who went to school, people who were Christians, let's be honest, people who had a God, people who had an appreciation for the modern technological society that was developing. That's what he means by civilized. He's not casting aspersions on the various habits of people. That's not the point. That's what they meant by civilized. And it's a common term used throughout the Western world. Again, I don't want to sugarcoat it. He expressed some views about people. He'll do the same thing with the Chinese. I'm sure you got a quote about the Chinese. Okay, let's go with the Chinese because again, he's very much a person of his time. He needs to communicate in language that people understand. And so, in my view, he's using words that people will recognize. He's showing them that he understands their concerns, racist as they are, but he's trying to make them move into a more progressive stance.
How would you compare his treatment of Chinese immigrants to other prime ministers of the day?
Again, Johnny Macdonald has the distinction of establishing a condition on Chinese immigration that was not applied elsewhere. In other words, under Macdonald in 1885, there's a $50 head tax. If you're a person of Chinese origin and you want to move to Canada, you're going to have to pay a $50 head tax. Terrible thing, racist thing, absolutely, undeniably. Compared to his successors, Sir Wilfrid Laurier will come in and multiply that head tax by 10 times. It'll be $500 when they come in. Mackenzie King will bar immigration from China in the early 1920s. Macdonald, compared to that, is a progressive. By the way, Canada is the only country on the Pacific Rim that still allows Chinese immigration in 1885. That singles out Sir Johnny Macdonald above everybody else.
And how about in comparison to Presidents Hayes or Arthur in the States?
There is an absolute wall. It was undeniable. You could not come into the United States if you were Chinese origin.
What about during Mackenzie King's time 30 years after Macdonald's death? I mean, that wasn't a shining moment for Canada either, was it?
In terms of immigration?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a liberal government in this case, and a continuation of that racism against Asians, against Chinese in particular. So Mackenzie King will bring in a law that outlaws completely Chinese immigration. There's an indication of anti-Semitism in Mackenzie King that certainly Sir Johnny Macdonald did not have. He wanted Jews to come into Canada because he thought a lot of them could go out west and farm. Not too many of them did, but he's on the record saying, we want these people. They'd be good, great Canadians.
That would be unusual for a guy born in Scotland and who was of Upper Canada at the time to have a kind of positive impression of the Jewish community. Right?
He did, but there's an aspect of Macdonald that we often forget, is that he's a child of refugees himself. He comes from a Highland family. They come to Canada in 1820 with a whole wave of Scots who are leaving their country because it's not a hospitable place for them anymore. And so he comes to Canada, and I think he still kept that mentality. Sir Johnny Macdonald kept a very strong link to Scotland all through his life. It meant something to him, and I think that the way he saw the evolution of the Scots, which is dramatically improving. I mean, after the refugee wave is going, there's a renewal of the Scottish identity, largely because of Queen Victoria. And there's a refreshing of that identity. And I think that affected Macdonald particularly. He saw that civilizations can change. He saw that there's always a better tomorrow if you work at it. And I think that applied to his view of Indigenous people. I think it applied to his view of Canadians in general, that there is a room for improvement. And let's stick with it and see if we can find a better way.
Let me circle back to voting, because you mentioned he made efforts to get women to vote, to get Indigenous people to vote.
Yes.
How did that go?
Well, on women, that was a crash and burn. Liberals and conservatives would absolutely not abide by the idea that a woman could vote. I mean, that debate lasted a couple of days, and Macdonald said, okay, I throw in the towel, but I want the Indigenous to vote. And of course, the Liberals are saying, are you saying that Big Bear, who's just declared war, whose people, not Big Bear, whose people have declared war on Canada, should have the right to vote? Yes, absolutely. Should black people have the right to vote? Absolutely. Should Indian people have the vote? Yes, they are sons of the soil. They need to vote. They should vote. Why not? They're good people. They know the freedom. They know freedom. They understand freedom. They understand our culture. That's remarkable. He says that in the House of Commons. It doesn't apply to the Chinese, however. He doesn't think that the Chinese have an understanding of democracy. And he's under real pressure from his caucus, the BC caucus, to make sure that the Chinese don't vote, because there was a real concern that they would hold the balance of power, and that ultimately it would be the Chinese men who were temporarily in Canada to build a railway who would ultimately decide the fate of democracy in Canada or in British Columbia. And that was a bridge too far.
Well, we're talking about 1885. The next election after he gives these groups the franchise is 1887. What happens in that election?
It's a real triumph. Macdonald, I mean, the 1885 is a massive transformation of the right to vote. Again, a lot of people are opposed. The Liberals are opposed. They fear that Macdonald is going to trick them into something. Yeah, and it turns out it's a trick, but it's a really good trick for us as a democracy. Sir John A. Macdonald's reforms in 1885 will increase the number of voters by 40%. And in 1887, barely 15 months after the year 1885, he is triumphantly reelected. He loses 10 seats, Steve, but he gains 7% of the vote, including in Quebec. And 4 years later, in 1891, he will again win.
Despite hanging Riel.
Despite hanging Riel. John A. Macdonald understood, as perhaps no other prime minister since then, the prejudices of Canadians, but also their ambitions and their dreams. And that reflected in his policies, and that's why he was so successful.
Okay, so that's much of the Macdonald record as it sat in 1885, and now I want to bring you back full circle to today.
Yes.
And here's how you close the book. Sheldon, let's bring this up if you would, and I'll read along for those listening on podcast. Patrice Tatil writes, it's hard to imagine a reputation being trashed so hatefully, so suddenly, and so thoroughly. 9 of Macdonald's 11 statues have been removed. The smear campaigns have had an impact. While public surveys show that most Canadians continue to appreciate Macdonald's significant accomplishments, he appears increasingly as a broken myth to younger generations. Students are taught that Macdonald is a person of whom Canadians should be ashamed. He is loudly derided as uniquely devoted to pursuing power for patronage purposes, a racist, a colonialist, a prototypical Nazi, an architect of indigenous genocide, animated by the sole purpose of killing the Indian to save the child, one of the phrases routinely and falsely attributed to him that was actually uttered by an American educator.
That sounds like a run-on sentence. I'm sorry.
You capture what you meant to say very clearly. So the question then today becomes, you obviously would like us to have a second look at this cancellation of Macdonald. What does that look like?
I think it starts with, I'm going to sound like a Canadian. Maybe we should have a commission on this. I think that there has to be a new appreciation, a new willingness among governments to lead the discussion on Sir John A. Macdonald. What I mean by that is perhaps to take another look at the curriculum and open the pages of the curriculum, open the pages that are presented to our students and explain the Sir John A. Macdonald that I see, that others have seen. I'm not the only one. Let's have a public discussion. I'm talking about at the local level, where streets are being renamed, where those monuments have been taken down. Is it not time to perhaps say, look, given the record of Sir John A. Macdonald, maybe that statue that we've had hiding should come back. It's a painful discussion. Perhaps it should not be. And I'm being idealistic here. I think it's really a tragedy that the man who did so much for the creation of our country, for the establishment of our country, not just confederation, but bringing in provinces, claiming territory, defending the territory, defending it in Washington, in London, should be dismissed as utterly unimportant. It's unbelievable that we have this kind of situation. I cannot think of another nation that is so dismissive of one of its most important founding fathers.
The flip side of that coin, though, is some people have observed that Canada ought to get extra marks for being prepared to sort of knock down myths about its founding fathers and find fault with them and not try to sugarcoat that part of our history. What do you say to that?
But you have to compare it to the overall record. If a person did wrong and only dedicated himself or herself to wrong, I would be the first one to claim that statue should not stand. But when you have an overwhelming record, such as the one that belongs to Sir John A. Macdonald, I think this deserves another look. We've had 10 years of discussion. Very little of it has been based on truth. We've had reputation, hearsay, that kind of stuff. Let's actually lead a new discussion on Sir John A. Macdonald and rediscover some of the virtues that he bequeathed to us.
Well, last question here. Give some advice to the MPPs at Queen's Park who, in their wisdom, have decided to board up the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald at the southern tip of the South Lawn at Queen's Park. It has been boarded up for, I think, going on 4 years now. Yeah. What should they do with it?
The short answer or the long answer? The short answer, I think that they need to lead a discussion. It should not be done radically. There should be some speeches. There should be some debate in the House. There should be at least the effort to try to rebuild the consensus around Sir John A. Macdonald. I'm confident that if people are allowed to speak to the record, Sir John Macdonald's reputation will be restored because it's that strong. After that, let's take down that shroud. Let's maybe build up police protection for a while because there probably will be a storm. But let's lead the province. Hamilton should be doing the same thing. Kingston should be doing the same thing. And I realize that I'm speaking radical thoughts here. But at some point, those statues need to be restored. And maybe they need to be maybe they need a better place, a safer place. Let's have those places. I wish they'd be restored where they were before because Sir John A. Macdonald deserves the recognition and the respect that is due to him.
Well, the name of the book is Sir John A. Macdonald and the Apocalyptic Year 1885. Read the book yourself. Come to your own conclusions about Sir John A. Patrice Dutil has put his views on the record, and we thank you for coming into TVO tonight to share them.
Thank you so much, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Friday, January 10th, 2025. Monday on the program, with property taxes going up in several Ontario municipalities, do we need a new deal for cities? I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you again back here on Monday.
Next week on the agenda.
I told myself and I told my colleagues on council, I would much rather that we get half of something than 100% of nothing. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the guiding philosophy, again, especially when you consider that so many people, in particular young families that are just starting out, are telling all of us in leadership positions it's not okay that housing has become so unattainable and so expensive in the neighborhoods where they grew up. And that's what I'm trying to work on.
That's next week on the agenda.